Lonely rancher found a widow wandering the plains with 3 hungry children. He whispered, "Come home with me." A dying man's last words to his wife were, "Keep our children safe." But what she found on that dusty Montana prairie would change everything she thought she knew about survival, love, and second chances. The dust came first, rolling across the endless grass like a brown ocean wave that had forgotten how to break. Sarah Mitchell pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and squinted into the wind that carried grip between her teeth and stung her eyes until they watered. The broken wheel of their wagon sat crooked in the dirt, splintered and scattered like the bones of some long-dead animal that had crawled here to die. "Mama." Little Emma's voice was small as a bird's whisper, barely heard above the wind that never seemed to stop out here on this godforsaken prairie. "When are we going home?" Sarah's hands trembled as she smoothed her daughter's tangled hair. Home was a word that no longer held meaning. Home had been Thomas's strong arms around her at night, his steady voice reading scripture by candlelight, his calloused hands building their life one careful board at a time. Home had been buried in a shallow grave 2 weeks past, marked only by a wooden cross that the wind would likely claim before summer's end. "Soon, baby," she lied, because lies were sometimes kinder than truth, and truth was a luxury she could no longer afford. The baby, little Samuel, stirred against her chest and began that thin crying that meant hunger, a sound that had become as constant as her own heartbeat. She had nothing left to give him. The last of their flour had been mixed with prairie water 3 days ago, and even that was gone now. Her milk had dried up with her tears, leaving only the hollow ache where nourishment should be. 8-year-old Matthew stood beside the wagon like a small sentinel, his father's old hat too big for his head, the brim casting shadows that made him look older than his years. He had not spoken since they buried Thomas, had only nodded when she told him they had to leave their little farm, had to find work somewhere, anywhere that would take a woman with 3 children and nothing else to offer. The wind shifted, and Sarah caught the scent of water on the air, sweet and clean and precious as gold in this dry land. She gathered Samuel closer and took Emma's hand, her fingers small and cold despite the heat. "Come, Matthew," she called, and her son fell into step beside them without question, his silence as heavy as the dust that coated everything they owned. The well sat in a small grove of cottonwoods, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. Sarah had heard of this place from other travelers, a landmark where the prairie gave up its water freely, where tired souls could rest in the shade and remember what it felt like to be human. She knelt beside the stone circle and drew up bucket after bucket of clear water, drinking first herself, then giving Emma small sips, then dampening her fingers to wet the baby's lips. Matthew drank like a man dying of thirst, which perhaps he was. They all were, in ways that went deeper than the body's simple needs. It was there, in the shade of trees that had stood witness to 1,000 prairie sorrows, that Jacob Stone found them. He came riding out of the heat shimmer like something born from the dust itself, tall and lean in his saddle, his horse's hooves raising small clouds with each step. Sarah looked up from the well and saw him watching them with eyes the color of winter sky, pale and distant but not unkind. His face was weathered like old leather, marked by sun and wind, and something deeper that she recognized because she carried it too, the particular weariness that came from losing everything that mattered. He dismounted slow and careful, the way a man moves when he has learned not to startle wild things. His boots made soft sounds on the packed earth as he approached the well, and Sarah found herself pulling the children closer, not from fear but from the instinct of a mother bird protecting her nest. He said, touching the brim of his hat, his voice rough as sandpaper but gentle in the way that told her he understood about being careful with broken things. "Sir," she replied, her own voice barely more than a whisper. Samuel had stopped crying for the moment, worn out by hunger and heat, his small body heavy against her shoulder. Jacob knelt beside the well and drew up his own bucket, drinking long and deep before splashing water over his face and the back of his neck. The silence stretched between them like a rope, not uncomfortable but heavy with unspoken questions. "You traveling far?" he asked finally, settling back on his heels. Sarah looked at her children, at Emma's hollow cheeks and Matthew's too serious eyes, at the baby who had grown so thin his clothes hung loose as burial shrouds. "Far as we need to," she said. Jacob nodded as if this answer made perfect sense, as if he understood that sometimes a person traveled not towards something but away from everything that hurt too much to remember. His eyes took in their broken wagon, their dusty clothes, the way they huddled together like survivors of some terrible storm. "Lost my wife and little girl to the fever last spring," he said, the words falling into the space between them like stones into deep water. "Been a long summer since then." Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, a small fissure in the wall she had built around her heart. "My husband," she whispered. 2 weeks passed. Same fever. The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves with a sound like rain, and for a moment neither of them spoke. But there was nothing to say about fever, about the way it took the good and left the rest to figure out how to keep breathing. Jacob stood and walked to his horse, returning with a cloth bundle that he set beside the well. Inside was bread, still soft, and strips of dried beef, and a small jar of preserves that caught the light like amber. "For the children," he said, not meeting her eyes. Sarah's throat closed tight. Pride warred with desperation, and desperation won because it had to, because her children's hunger was louder than her shame. "Thank you," she managed. As Emma and Matthew fell on the food with the careful greed of the very hungry, Jacob gazed out across the prairie toward the horizon where his ranch waited in the distance. Sarah saw something shift in his face, a decision being made in the slow way that important choices always are. "I got a place," he said finally. "Big house. Too big for just me. Could use help with the animals, the garden. Winter's coming, and it gets fierce out here." Sarah stared at him, this stranger who had appeared from the dust like an answer to prayers she had been afraid to speak. "I don't have anything to offer in return," she said. "Nothing but work and 3 mouths to feed." "Sometimes," Jacob said, his eyes finding hers at last, "that's everything." The baby stirred against her shoulder, and Sarah felt the weight of the choice before her. She could keep walking, keep searching for something that might not exist, keep watching her children grow thinner and more hollow-eyed with each passing day. Or she could trust this quiet man who understood about fever and loss and the way silence could be kinder than words. "Come home with me," he whispered, and the words hung in the air between them like a bridge across a deep canyon. Sarah looked at her children, at Emma's face smudged with dust and hope, at Matthew's careful stillness, at the baby who deserved more than uncertainty and empty bellies. She thought of Thomas and the promises they had made to each other about protecting their family, about doing whatever it took to keep their children safe and fed and loved. The wind carried the scent of coming rain, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled like a promise of better days. The house stood like a patient giant against the endless sky, its wooden bones weathered grey by years of prairie wind and sun. Sarah Mitchell stood on the wide porch holding baby Samuel, watching Jacob Stone disappear into the morning mist with his cattle, a figure made small by the vastness that surrounded them all. The silence he left behind felt different from the silence she had known on the trail, warmer somehow, but heavy with questions neither of them knew how to ask. "Mama, is this our house now?" Emma whispered, her small hand finding Sarah's skirt, fingers twisting the worn fabric the way she used to twist her father's suspenders when she needed comfort. "For now, baby," Sarah answered, though she did not know what "for now" meant in this place where time seemed to move slow as honey, where the horizon stretched so far it made her dizzy to think about tomorrow, let alone next month or next year. Inside, the house told stories in every creaking board and faded curtain. A woman's touch lingered in the careful arrangement of dishes on shelves too high for children to reach, in the quilt folded neat at the foot of the big bed, in the way morning light found the kitchen window just right to warm the wooden table where someone else had once kneaded bread and sorted beans and hummed songs that now lived only in the walls. Thomas, 6 years old and serious as his father had been, stood in the doorway to what had been Jacob's family room, his small hands pressed flat against the doorframe as if testing whether this new world would hold his weight. Baby Mary sat on the braided rug, her thumb in her mouth, watching everything with dark eyes that had learned too young that safe places could disappear without warning. Sarah unpacked their few belongings in the spare room Jacob had given them, 3 children sharing one narrow bed while she made do with blankets on the floor, though he had offered her the room with the big bed, the one that still smelled faintly of lavender and sorrow. She could not take that space, could not sleep where another woman had dreamed and loved and died too soon. The first meals were careful affairs. Jacob would come in from his morning work, boots heavy on the wooden porch, hat in his hands, nodding silent greetings before washing at the basin Sarah kept filled with fresh water. She cooked what she could from his well-stocked pantry, beans and cornbread, sometimes eggs from the hens that pecked and scratched behind the house like small feathered gossips sharing secrets in the dust. They sat at opposite ends of the long table, the children between them like a bridge neither adult knew how to cross. Emma would steal glances at Jacob's weathered hands as he ate, fascinated by the scars that mapped his knuckles like tiny rivers. Thomas kept his eyes on his plate, but Sarah noticed how he straightened his shoulders when Jacob was near, trying to fill the space his father had left empty. Little Mary said nothing at all, Just watched this strange man who smelled like leather and hay and something she could not name, but that made her feel less afraid of the dark corners. Jacob ate slow and methodical, the way a man does when eating has become a chore instead of a pleasure. Sometimes Sarah caught him looking at the children with something like hunger in his pale eyes, and she understood that he was remembering other small voices, other small hands reaching for biscuits and honey. After supper, he would excuse himself to the porch, where he sat in the old rocking chair and watched the sun paint the sky in colors that had no names. Sarah would clean the dishes and settle the children, and through the window she could see his profile against the dying light, still as a statue carved from loneliness. But kindness, Sarah learned, had its own quiet language. In the mornings, she would find small wooden animals on the kitchen table, a horse for Thomas, carved with careful detail down to the flowing menere, a tiny doll for Emma, smooth and warm to the touch, a set of simple blocks for Mary, sanded soft so they would not hurt her small hands. Jacob never said where they came from, never acknowledged the hours he must have spent by lamplight, whittling away his insomnia with a sharp knife and patient love. Sarah began mending his clothes without asking, taking the torn shirts and worn socks from the basket by the door, working on them in the evening light while the children played with their new toys. She reinforced the patches on his work pants, replaced the missing buttons on his Sunday shirt, dammed the holes in his socks with thread that matched so well he might never notice the repair. They were small gestures, these offerings of care, like prayers whispered in a language both of them were learning to speak. The children began to thaw like ice in spring sunshine. Emma started humming while she helped with simple chores, her voice sweet and clear as birdsong. Thomas asked shy questions about the cattle, about how to tell which cow was which, about whether the big bull with the scarred horn was truly as mean as he looked. Even Mary began to smile, just small curves at the corners of her mouth when Jacob would nod at her across the breakfast table or when she found a new wooden toy waiting beside her plate. It was Sarah who discovered the graves. She had been hanging laundry on the line behind the house, the wet sheets snapping like flags in the constant wind, when she saw the two stone markers half hidden in the tall grass. They stood close together, one tall and one small, carved with names and dates that told a story too sad for words. Margaret Stone, beloved wife and mother, 1821 to 1878, and Lucy Stone, precious daughter, 1874 to 1878. Sarah stood among the drying clothes, her hands still clutching a damp pillowcase, and felt her heart break a little more for this man who had opened his home to strangers when his own world had crumbled to dust. 4 years. He had been alone for 4 long years, keeping house for ghosts, carving toys for children who would never again run laughing through these rooms. That evening, she found him there. Jacob knelt in the grass between the two stones, his hat in his hands, his lips moving in words too soft to hear. The setting sun painted everything gold and red, and Sarah could see the tears on his weathered cheeks, falling slow and steady as rain on dry ground. She did not approach him. Some griefs were too private for comfort, too raw for the kindness of strangers. Instead, she gathered her children close and led them inside, where she tucked them into bed with extra stories and longer prayers, understanding now why this house felt so full of waiting, why Jacob moved through his days like a man walking through a dream of better times. Outside, the wind carried the scent of approaching autumn, and somewhere in the darkness, a man sat with his buried heart and remembered what it had cost him to love. The winter had been long and quiet, but when the first green shoots pushed through the last patches of snow, something stirred in Sarah's chest that she had not felt in months. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe just the simple need to put her hands in the earth and make something grow. Jacob stood at the kitchen window, watching the morning light spread across the fields. His coffee had gone cold in his hands, but he did not seem to notice. Sarah moved beside him, her own cup warm against her palms, and together they looked out at the land that would need tending. Time for planting, Jacob said, his voice soft as the morning air. Sarah nodded. She had helped her husband plant before, back when the world made sense and the future stretched before them like a straight road. Now everything felt different, the ground beneath her feet, the sky above her head, even her own hands when she looked at them. "I want to help," she said. Jacob turned to look at her, his eyes holding that careful expression he wore when he was trying not to hope too much. "You already do more than enough. The children, the house, the meals. I want to help with the planting," Sarah said again, firmer this time. "My hands remember the work." Something passed across Jacob's face then, like sunlight moving over water. He nodded once, slow and sure. The first day, Sarah's hands were clumsy with the seeds. She had forgotten the weight of them, the way they felt like small promises between her fingers. Emma and Thomas ran between the rows, chasing grasshoppers and calling out to each other in voices that carried across the prairie like birdsong. Little Mary sat in the shade of the wagon, playing with a corn husk doll that Jacob had made for her the night before. Sarah watched her children as she worked, their faces brown from the sun, their clothes dusty but clean. They looked different here than they had in those terrible weeks after their father died. Stronger. More solid, like they were growing roots in this place just as surely as the seeds they planted. "You're thinking too hard," Jacob said from the row beside her. Sarah looked up, surprised. She had been lost in watching Thomas try to catch a butterfly, his small hands reaching towards something beautiful that would not be caught. "Am I?" "Your face gets quiet when you think too hard. Like you're carrying something heavy." Sarah pressed her lips together. She had not known that anyone was watching her face, learning the way her thoughts showed on her skin. It felt strange and unsettling, like being seen when she thought she was invisible. "I was thinking about time," she said finally. "How it moves different now. Before, it felt like we were always rushing toward something. Now it feels like we are just here." Jacob nodded, understanding in a way that did not require words. He had lost time too, whole years of it, buried with his wife and child in the small cemetery behind the house. Sarah had seen him there sometimes in the early morning, standing among the wooden crosses with his hat in his hands. They worked through the morning, their hands finding the rhythm of the earth. Plant, cover, move forward. Plant, cover, move forward. The sun climbed higher, and Sarah's back began to ache, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from useful work. At midday, they stopped to eat the lunch Sarah had packed, bread and cold meat and water that tasted of the well. The children sprawled in the shade, tired from their playing, and for a moment the prairie was quiet except for the wind moving through the grass. "Tell me about the harvest," Sarah said. Jacob looked surprised. "The harvest? What it's like when the corn comes in. If the wheat turns gold like they say. I want to picture it." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant horizon. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memory. "Anna used to love harvest time," he said. "She would get up before dawn to bake pies for the workers who came to help. The whole house would smell like cinnamon and apples, and she would hum while she worked. Said the harvest was God's way of keeping his promises." Sarah felt something twist in her chest at the mention of Jacob's wife. Not jealousy exactly, but something more complicated. The knowledge that this man had loved someone else completely, had built a life with her in this very place where Sarah now tried to make sense of her own broken pieces. "What do you think now?" she asked quietly. "About God's promises?" Jacob's hands stilled on his cup. The children's voices seemed very far away, and Sarah wondered if she had asked too much, pushed too hard into places that still hurt to touch. "I think," Jacob said slowly, "that sometimes the promises look different than we expected. But maybe they're still there." That evening, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into its familiar quietness, Sarah found herself on the front porch. The stars were coming out, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. She had grown to love these moments when the day was done and the night stretched out before them like a dark blanket. The door opened behind her, and Jacob stepped out. He had taken to joining her on the porch in the evenings, though they rarely spoke much. Tonight he carried 2 cups of coffee, and he handed one to her before settling into the chair beside hers. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the prairie at night. Sarah thought about the seeds they had planted, buried now in the dark earth, waiting for whatever would come. "Jacob," she said finally. "Yes." "The graves behind the house. Would you tell me about them?" She felt him go still beside her, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. But then his voice came, quiet and careful. "Anna died in childbirth," he said. "The baby lived for 3 hours. Just long enough for me to hold him and tell him his name." Sarah closed her eyes. She knew this kind of loss, though hers had come differently. The sharp edge of it, the way it could cut you open when you least expected it. What was his name? "David. After my father." "David," Sarah repeated softly, tasting the name like a prayer. They sat in silence again, but it felt different now. Deeper somehow, like they had shared something that could not be taken back. "I used to talk to them," Jacob said after a while. In the mornings, when I would go out to tend the horses, I would tell them about the weather, or if the cattle were doing well. Sometimes I would ask Anna what she thought about something, like she might answer, "Do you still?" Jacob turned to look at her, his face half hidden in the darkness. Not as much. It felt like I was holding onto something that was already gone. Like I was afraid to let them rest. Sarah understood this too. The way grief could become a familiar weight, something you carried because you were afraid that without it, you might forget what you had lost. I still reach for William sometimes, she said. In bed at night, or when I hear something funny and want to tell him. My hand will move toward the place where he used to be, and then I remember. It gets easier, Jacob said. Not the missing, but the way you carry it. Like learning to walk with a limp. Eventually you don't think about it every step. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and Sarah thought about the corn seeds sleeping in the earth, waiting for rain and sun and time to work their slow magic. Maybe healing was like that too, something that happened underground, in the darkness, until one day you looked up and found that something new had grown. I want to plant flowers, she said suddenly. On their graves. Wildflowers that will come back every year without tending. Jacob nodded slowly. Anna would have liked that. She always said the prairie was too beautiful to stay empty. As they rose to go inside, Sarah felt something shift between them, like a door opening just a crack. Not love, not yet, but something that might grow into love if given time and care. Something that acknowledged the people they had been before this place, before this careful dance of healing they were learning together. The wind stirred the grass around the house, and Sarah listened to its voice, no longer lonely but not yet familiar. Tomorrow there would be more planting, more of the slow work of building something from the ruins of what had come before. The morning Mary first called him Papa Jacob, the world seemed to tilt on its axis and settle into a new place entirely. She had been helping Sarah set the breakfast table, her small hands careful with the plates that seemed too big for her fingers. Jacob came in from the morning chores, his hair damp with mist and his boots leaving tracks across the kitchen floor. He was washing his hands at the basin when Mary's voice, clear as spring water, cut through the domestic quiet. Papa Jacob, are the horses hungry too? The silence that followed stretched like taffy, sweet and full of possibility. Sarah's hand stilled on the coffee pot, and Jacob turned slowly from the wash basin, water still dripping from his fingers. Mary looked up at him with those serious brown eyes, waiting for an answer to what seemed to her the most natural question in the world. Yes, little one, Jacob said, his voice rough around the edges. The horses are always hungry in the morning. Mary nodded solemnly and went back to arranging the forks, as if she had not just handed this man a gift he had never expected to receive again. But Sarah saw the way Jacob's shoulder straightened, the way he stood a little taller as he dried his hands. She saw the way he looked at Mary for the rest of breakfast, like he was memorizing the shape of her face. That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah found Jacob on the porch staring out at the stars. She had grown used to these quiet moments when the day's work was done, when they could sit together without the need for words. But tonight felt different, charged with something unnamed. She's never called anyone Papa before, Sarah said quietly, settling into the chair beside him. Not even. William died when she was barely 2. She doesn't remember him. Sarah's voice carried old grief, but not the sharp kind that used to cut her. This was grief worn smooth by time, like a stone in a creek bed. I used to worry that she would grow up without knowing what it meant to have a father. But maybe. She let the words hang in the air between them, unfinished but understood. Jacob reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused from work. It was not the first time they had touched. There had been brief moments, hands brushing as they passed dishes, shoulders bumping as they worked in the garden. But this felt intentional, like a choice they were both making. I never thought I would hear that word again, Jacob said. Papa. I used to practice it, when Anna was carrying David. I would say it out loud when no one was listening, trying to make it sound natural. It sounds natural now, Sarah said. They sat holding hands as the night deepened around them, and Sarah thought about the ways love could surprise you. She had loved William with the fierce certainty of youth, all fire and passion and promises about forever. But this thing growing between her and Jacob felt different, steadier, like something built to last through seasons of hardship. The harvest had been good that year, better than Jacob had seen in 3 seasons. The corn stood tall and golden in the fields, and the wheat whispered secrets to the wind. Emma had learned to help with the horses, her small hands sure and gentle as she brushed their coats. Thomas followed Jacob like a shadow, asking endless questions about cattle and fencing and why the sky was so big in Montana. And Mary, quiet Mary who spoke in whispers, had begun to sing to herself as she played with her dolls. The house, which had echoed with loneliness for so long, now hummed with the sounds of family. Footsteps on the stairs, laughter from the kitchen, the soft murmur of bedtime stories. Sarah had taken to mending Jacob's clothes in the evenings, her needle moving in steady rhythm while he whittled toys for the children. They had found their pattern, their dance of daily care that felt as natural as breathing. But it was more than routine that bound them. It was the way Jacob helped Thomas with his letters, his patience endless as the boy struggled with words that seemed to twist on the page. It was the way Sarah sang while she cooked, filling the kitchen with melodies that made Jacob stop his work just to listen. It was the way they both woke in the night when one of the children cried out from a dream, moving through the darkness toward whatever comfort was needed. One evening in late autumn, as the first frost painted the grass silver, the traveling preacher came through town. Reverend Mills was an old man with kind eyes and gentle hands, and he had known Jacob since he was a boy. He stayed for dinner, blessing the food and the family that sat around the table, and afterward he and Jacob walked out to look at the graves behind the house. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as the 2 men stood among the wooden crosses, their heads bowed in prayer or memory. When they came back inside, Reverend Mills's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "It's good to see this house full of life again," he said to Sarah. "Jacob has carried his grief like a stone in his chest for too long." That night, after the preacher had gone to sleep in the spare room, Jacob came to Sarah as she finished tidying the kitchen. He moved differently, like a man who had made a decision and was gathering courage to speak it. "Sarah," he said, and her name sounded different in his mouth, more careful somehow. She turned to face him, her hands still damp from washing dishes. In the lamplight, his face looked younger, less marked by the weight of old sorrow. "The preacher will be here another day before he moves on," Jacob said. If we wanted, he could marry us. Make it official before God and anyone who cares to witness." Sarah felt her heart do something complicated in her chest, a flutter that was part joy, part terror. She had known this moment would come, had felt it building like weather on the horizon. But knowing and being ready were different things entirely. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "I want you to stay," Jacob said simply. "You and the children. I want us to be a family, not just people sharing a house. I want Mary to keep calling me Papa Jacob without worrying that someone might take her away. I want Emma to know she's safe here, that this is her home. I want Thomas to have my name if he wants it." "And what about us?" Sarah asked quietly. "What about you and me?" Jacob stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to smell the soap he had used to wash his hands. "I love you," he said, and the words fell between them like seeds finding soil. "Not the way I loved Anna. That was different. We were different people then. But I love the way you hum while you cook, and the way you check on the children 3 times before you go to bed. I love that you mend my shirts without being asked, and the way you listen when I tell stories about the cattle. I love that you made this house feel like home again without ever trying to erase what came before." Sarah reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that grief and weather had carved there. "I love you too," she said, and felt the truth of it settle in her bones. "I love your patience with the children, and the way you carved Mary a new doll when her old one fell apart. I love that you talk to the horses like they understand every word. I love that you loved Anna and David so well, because it tells me how you love, with everything you have." When Jacob kissed her, it was soft and sure, like a promise kept. Not the desperate hunger of young love, but something deeper and more lasting. The kiss of 2 people who had been broken and were learning to be whole again, together. They were married the next morning in the front parlor, with Reverend Mills reading from his worn Bible and the children standing witness in their best clothes. Emma held Mary's hand, and Thomas tried to stand tall like a man, and when Sarah became Sarah Stone, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. That winter was different from the one before. The house seemed warmer somehow, even when the wind howled across the prairie and the snow piled high against the windows. Sarah and Jacob shared their marriage bed with the careful tenderness of people who had learned that love was not just feeling but action, not just desire but choice made new each day. On the coldest nights, when the wind rattled the windows and the fire burned low, they would lie awake talking about their plans for spring. More cattle, perhaps. A vegetable garden closer to the house. Maybe even a horse for Emma, who had proven herself capable and careful with the animals. But mostly they talked about the children, their hopes and dreams for Emma and Thomas and Mary. Good schools when they were old enough, trips to town for supplies and socializing, birthday celebrations, and Christmas mornings. The future that spread before them like a well-tended field, ready for whatever seeds they chose to plant. One evening in February, with the snow falling thick and soft outside the windows, Sarah found Jacob in the parlor teaching Thomas to whittle. The boy's tongue stuck out in concentration as he tried to shape a piece of wood into something that might eventually become a horse. Jacob's hands covered Thomas's smaller ones, guiding the knife with patient care. "Like this, son," Jacob said. "Feel the grain of the wood. It wants to be carved a certain way. Your job is to listen to what it's telling you." "Son." The word hung in the air like a blessing, and Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She had not heard Thomas called son since William died, and she had forgotten how sweet that word could sound. From the kitchen came the sound of Emma helping Mary with her letters, their voices blending in the rhythm of learning. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind outside seemed not lonely but protective, wrapping around their house like arms holding something precious. This was home, Sarah realized. Not the place but the people, not the building but the love that filled it. Home was Jacob's careful hands teaching her son to whittle. Home was Mary's sleepy voice calling for Papa Jacob when nightmares woke her. Home was Emma's laughter as she chased chickens in the yard, and Thomas's serious questions about the way things worked. Home was the daily choice to love and be loved, to build something stronger than the sum of their broken parts. Later, as they prepared for bed, Jacob paused at the window that looked out toward the small cemetery behind the house. Sarah joined him there, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Do you think they would approve?" he asked quietly. "Anna and William. Do you think they would want this for us?" Sarah considered the question, thinking of William's last words about keeping their children safe, about the love that had defined his too short life. "I think," she said slowly, "that love never really dies. It just changes shape, finds new places to grow. And I think anyone who loved us would want us to be happy, to build something good from what's left." Jacob nodded, and together they turned away from the past and toward their present, toward the warm house full of sleeping children, toward the marriage bed where they would lie together and plan for tomorrow, toward the love that had surprised them both with its quiet strength. Outside, the wind sang its ancient song across the prairie, but it no longer sounded lonely to Sarah's ears.